We're going to go ahead and get started with a presentation by a longtime friend of mine, Scott Patchan, who will talk about Lincoln and the Shenandoah, 1862, 1864. Scott Patchan is the author of many articles and books, including Shenandoah Summer, the 1864 Valley Campaign, Second Manassas, Longstreet's attack and struggle for Chinn Ridge, and the last Battle of Winchester, Phil Sheridan, Jubal Early, and the Shenandoah Valley Campaign. He is currently finishing a book about George Washington and the French and Indian War. And for those in the Civil War conferences and tours and that know Scott very well for being a frequent tour guide on battlefields in the Shenandoah Valley, Second Manassas, and does an excellent job doing that. So welcome, Scott, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, John. First of all, I would just thank John for the invitation and just express what an honor it is to be here speaking at the National United States Army Museum. President Abraham Lincoln and the Shenandoah Valley, in many ways, the two can be looked at the entire war experience for Lincoln in a microcosm. We will see him grow from somebody who is micromanaging details and where he continues to mature, and we'll see in 1864 a different outcome of the campaigns as he takes a more hands-off approach, and the other in 1864 is the election, the re-election, and what an important impact the Shenandoah Valley would have on his re-election in both positive and negative time impacts as the time went on through the summer and fall of 1864. Now, in 1862, Valley Campaign starts off on March 23rd of 1862, where Stonewall Jackson, suffers his only defeat at the Battle of Kernstown on March 23rd at the hands of Colonel Nathan Kimball. His official commander, who was most of the time credited with this victory, General James Shields, had been slightly wounded a few days before, and he was unable to take the field. However, once his army had won that victory in late March of 1862, Shields begins spouting off in his communiques back to Washington and the War Department and ultimately Lincoln, the massive size. Jackson had no more than 3,000 men on the battlefield, and Shields magnified that several times over. And even though he had won, his forces has won, they were quite lucky to have been successful against this powerful force that Jackson had arrayed in the Shenandoah Valley. So what that does in the mind of Abraham Lincoln and his administration in Washington, D.C., is right away creates a heightened sense of anxiety and a heightened fear of this powerful force operating in the Shenandoah Valley. There were many in the Lost Cause era that would try and spin Kernstown as a Confederate victory because of that impact that it had on the larger operational impact of the entire 62 Valley Campaign in the spring of that year. It would continue on. Jackson would be reinforced and regrouped until May, early May, when he would begin taking offensive operations. By that time, the Union forces had split up. And I'm going to jump ahead a few slides here, just to give you an impact. So the Shenandoah Valley, and this only encompasses about the northern portion of the valley and not the entire area, but from the Potomac River to Lexington, which is south of Stanton and off of this map, is nearly 160 miles in length. One of the most important features of this valley is that if you'll look, Washington, D.C. would be off about 60, 70 miles to the right of Winchester there and off the map. It's pointing towards the northeast. It is an appropriate avenue of invasion for Confederate forces who are operating in the Shenandoah Valley. And as part of when we get into the 1864 campaign, we will see exactly how that happened. Now, for Union forces who are operating in the Shenandoah Valley and trying to, go on the offensive, and remember, the primary Union objective is the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, which is going to be way over down southeast of Gordonsville. So as Union forces in the valley move southwest, even in they're having success tactically in the valley, they are moving farther away from the big strategic prize that the Union armies in Virginia had with their constant on to Richmond rhetoric. So they're moving away from that. So it presents a geographic advantage to the Confederacy in just the natural layout of the Shenandoah Valley. And Stonewall Jackson would use this quite well. He would march out of Stanton, head west into the Allegheny Mountains. Now, when he's doing this beginning of May, there's a force out in West Virginia coming south out of Moorefield. It's part of Fremont's army, and the vanguard is under General Robert Milroy, and they're approaching Stanton from the west. And why is Stanton the key here? If you take a look at Stanton, you see that railroad line running out of there. That makes you've got the Shenandoah Valley Turnpike running north and south out of Stanton, which is a macadamized road, great for hauling crops and other supplies that are manufactured in the valley, where they get put on the railroad at Stanton and carried across the Blue Ridge to Gordonsville and on to Lee's army in Richmond or wherever else it might be operating at that point in time. So they want to go get the railroad at Stanton. Well, Jackson's army, reinforced to the tune of about 16,000 men, will march west out of Stanton, and he will defeat Milroy at the Battle of McDowell, who only had about 5,000 men under his joint command of him and General Robert Shea. And they will be defeated. They will retreat farther back up into the mountains of West Virginia, and there they will join hands with more Union forces. But they are going to be essentially out of the campaign for the next month. So Jackson at that point turns around and begins marching northward through the main Shenandoah Valley. He'll cross over into the area. If you see word New Market there to the right of it, you'll see Luray. That's called the Luray Valley between the Blue Ridge and Massanutten Mountain. He's going to go north through there. And by May 23rd, he will attack federal outpost of General Nathaniel Banks' force that had been stationed in the Shenandoah Valley proper, and defeat outpost at the Battle of Front Royal, and then go on to win the first battle of Winchester a couple of days later, smashing the army under Banks. Now, what we have to do here now and take a look at how does Lincoln react to this. So May 24th, that's the day after the Battle of Front Royal. So early in the morning, he's telling, and again, take all of this against the backdrop of George McClellan ringing in Lincoln's ear about needing more troops. He's conducting his Peninsula campaign. He's put the entire Army of the Potomac on boats down to Fort Monroe, and they're slowly moving up the Virginia Peninsula towards Richmond. And McClellan's refrain is, why is progress so slow? His answer is consistent: he needs more troops. Well, because of the operations in the Shenandoah Valley, he's not going to get troops, or at least anywhere near what he was originally expecting. So one of the key troops that he was expecting was McDowell's large corps, which was in the Fredericksburg area. And he's getting ready. So on the morning of the 4th, Lincoln telegraphs, McDowell and Shields both say they can and positively will move Monday morning, May 26th. I wish you to move cautiously and safely. You will have command of General McDowell after he joins you. McDowell was supposed to be the final piece of the puzzle that McClellan needed to be comfortable with to continue in on his final movements against Richmond and Joe Johnston's Army of Northern Virginia. However, after Banks' defeat, you see later in the day, by the end of the day, late afternoon, in consequence of Banks' critical position, I have been compelled to suspend McDowell's movements to join you. So, kind of see, in fairness to McClellan, you know, he's kind of like a yo-yo there going back and forth. The next day in the late morning, and again, Lincoln's under pressure. Lincoln is feeling because of this, well, you know, and he doesn't even know about Winchester, you know, that's yet. And he tells them, I think the time is near when you must either attack Richmond or give up the job and come to the defense of Washington. Think about that, all the effort in time, money, men, and material to transport the Army of the Potomac from the Washington area down to the Virginia Peninsula. And here in a matter of 24 hours, Abraham Lincoln has decided that you need to go all out right now, or we're calling it all off and you got to come back here and defend Washington. So that's how fearful they were of Stonewall Jackson's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. It would continue on through June. Jackson would win the Battle of First Winchester. And funny story there, one of the Union soldiers, a Wisconsin soldier, as he's sprinting northward in retreat with thousands of his comrades to avoid being ensnared by Jackson's pursuing legions, some officers are attempting to rally them, and they say, for God's sake, man, stop. Don't you love your country? And as the guy who was running north towards the Potomac River says, yes, I do. And I'm trying to get there as fast as I can. So, you know, it was very demoralizing time all around. Now, Jackson's going to continue moving to the northeast up towards Harper's Ferry. But Lincoln, the movement of McDowell is going to start moving in towards Front Royal area in the Shenandoah Valley from the east. And remember, I mentioned Milroy had joined some other forces in the mountains of West Virginia. That would be the Mountain Department, about 10 to 12,000 men under the command of General John Fremont, the Pathfinder, and they're moving in from the west. Now, if you're Jackson, you've just got reports that these two forces are moving. And I'll go ahead and bring up that map here again. So coming up here in from Strasburg, from Moorfield on the left, you have Fremont moving in towards the Shenandoah Valley. Over here through Manassas Gap, you have at Front Royal, McDowell. Jackson's going to get word of this, and he is going to retreat up the Shenandoah Valley proper and move all the way down towards Harrisonburg. And it will be there'll be a Battle of Harrisonburg in the first week of June of 1862, in which his famous cavalry leader, Turner Ashby, would be killed. And then he would retreat out to the area around Cross Keys in Port Republic. Now, Fremont's force has pursued Jackson down from Strasburg, down the Valley Pike through the Main Valley. The Main Valley is the area to the west of the Shenandoah and the Allegheny Mountains. That's what I refer to the Main Valley. That's the Shenandoah. To the east of the Massanutten, that's called the Luray Valley, sometimes the Page Valley. And it is going to be McDowell's troops that are going to move there. And it's only going to be one division of about 4,000 to 5,000 men under the command, again, of James Shields, the man who had added a lot of laurels to his name by claiming the credit for the actions that his subordinate, Nathan Kimball, earned at the Battle of Kernstown back in March of '62. So they're going to be pursuing them. So Jackson is waiting there at the southern tip of Massanutten Mountain for both armies. And he will confront on June the 8th, Fremont's army moving east out of Harrisonburg. They will attack at the Battle of Cross Keys. By the end of the day, Major General Dick Ewell and his division have destroyed, one entire regiment, the 8th New York Infantry, would be virtually annihilated with hundreds of men being killed and wounded in an ambush at the Battle of Cross Keys. And that kind of set a pale over all the operations for that day. And at the end of the day, all of the Union attacks had been repelled. There had been some limited Confederate counterattacks, but the Army of the Mountain Department under Fremont would fall back and would pose no further offensive threat to Jackson. So Jackson right away now is going to turn his attention to Shields' division, which by June the 9th has made it as far south as Conrad's Store there. And he's going to send about 2,500 men under the command of Colonel Erastus Tyler. And he's going to lead the vanguard. Once again, we're going to have Shields staying well away from the battlefield at Conrad's Store, while the greater part of his force is going to go with a subordinate officer down towards Port Republic. These troops are actually going to get into the village of Port Republic, and they're going to cross the river, and they're going to move to cut off the bridge and sever Jackson's line of retreat. However, as things are going for the Union cause in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862, this plan quickly falls into ruin as Jackson counterattacks. Now, this is happening on June the 8th, the same day that a few miles to the west, Dick Ewell's division is confronting Fremont at the Battle of Cross Keys. So Jackson is really feeling the pinch down there in the Port Republic area. So on the next day, the Union forces are going to dig in a few miles north of the village of Port Republic, and they're going to have a strong position. And Jackson's going to attack with about 9,000 men against Tyler's 2,500 men. They're going to repel the initial assaults. So Jackson's going to take a while. He's going to be attacking piecemeal, but eventually he's going to get flanked out of his position and routed. And Shields' division is going to retreat back to Front Royal, and Fremont's going to pull out of the valley as well, leaving Jackson in sole possession. Lincoln's fears, though, however, of the invasion of Jackson's force are never realized. Jackson will quickly be recalled, and by the last week of June, he will be playing important roles in the new commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's plans to evict George McClellan from the outskirts of Richmond. In the end, as a result of Jackson's plan, McDowell's entire corps, the greater part of it, would not join the effort. Only one division of those that had originally been slated to reinforce McClellan, that would be McCall's Pennsylvania Reserves, are going to be sent down to McClellan in his efforts against Richmond. So again, you see Lincoln's there. He's lost sight in 1862 of the bigger operational and strategic objectives in Virginia because of the panic that Jackson caused in the Shenandoah Valley. We would go on, and there would be some other changes that would occur. In 1863, the Valley will play a lesser role. It's part of the avenue of invasion. There'd be the Second Battle of Winchester, which really shouldn't have occurred. If the commander there, General Robert Milroy, had been acting prudently, he would have pulled back out of that exposed position, because Winchester sits in an open area of the valley and there's no natural defenses there. And Milroy thought he could hold out against the entire Army of Northern Virginia in the series of earthworks that he could have. But he was very brave on the battlefield, but in terms of these bigger pictured operational decisions, he could be very rash and foolhardy. And as a result of this, over half his force is destroyed and captured as the Army of Northern Virginia is heading up towards a date with destiny in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But one thing in 1863, you're already going to see Lincoln now working more through the War Department with Stanton. And I'm also going to give some credit here is a guy who wasn't on the scene in 1862, but tends to get a lot of bad PR in Civil War, and that would be Henry Halleck. I think Henry Halleck is a more stabilizing influence, and I'll talk some more about him as I get into the details on the 1864 campaign. So the Shenandoah Valley there, again, it's in 1864, things will go wrong. And one of the New York writer in one of the New York papers again says, it's the same old story. The back door via the Shenandoah Valley was left open again. And so there's a constant recognition. And so if you take that out to the bigger picture there of what's going on, see, things are going bad in the Valley. Things are going not so well for the overall Union war effort. Now, as we go into 1864, one thing that's very important to understand in terms of Abraham Lincoln is we all know what elections are like. And, you know, for all the bad press and things that we think we see, you start reading these newspapers in 1864 and 62 when these elections are going on, the nastiness and the bitterness and the vitriol and stuff it's over the top. And Lincoln, everything that he does in 1864 and the decisions that he makes he's a wartime president, and he is having a referendum on his conduct of the war in November of 1864. So everything that happens is going to be ultimately viewed politically. And it doesn't matter who the commander is, you know, the politics are there, and they are very real influence on the campaign. And the campaign, more importantly, is having a vital impact on those political campaigns of 1864. Now, the major change in 1864 is Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. He captured Vicksburg, Mississippi in July of 1863. He freed Chattanooga from the siege of Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee in November of 1863. This guy is on a roll. You know, he was reputedly criticized that he drank too much, and the legend in war goes that Lincoln said, "Well, find out what he's drinking and give it to the other generals." So, but Grant was a very determined man, and when he would set his mind to something, he tried to see it through to the end. He's very good at avoiding distractions and staying focused on the grand objectives. When he's appointed in the spring of 1863, the natural assumption was that he was going to get rid of all the high commanders from the Army of the Potomac. He chose not to do so. He leaves most of them in place. He brings in one officer from the West. And surprisingly, most people don't realize this, Phil Sheridan never served directly under Grant. So, but he's the only officer that comes in, and he will take over command of the Army of the Potomac's cavalry there. Lincoln and Grant will get there. They'll meet. Some of the things that Grant has to deal with is, again, politics. Certain generals have to have commands. When we're talking about the Shenandoah Valley in particular, there was General Franz Sigel, who was generally viewed as somewhat of an incompetent, but nevertheless, he was the darling of the German American community, and it was an election year, and the German vote was a key constituent of Abraham Lincoln. So Sigel has to have somewhat of an important command. So Grant reasons, let's put him out in the Shenandoah Valley. He can at least hold a leg while some of the others are doing the real skinning. Well, he didn't hold the leg down, and he ended up getting kicked into behind on May 15th at the Battle of Newmarket, defeated by former Vice President of the United States and Kentucky Senator John C. Breckinridge. A defeat probably largely brought about by Sigel's piecemeal tactics, stringing his army out along the Valley Pike and moving forward piecemeal. And by the time his entire army reaches the battlefield, the rear elements of it anyway, he's already been defeated there. So, but Grant and this is a situation that now, if we had gone back to 1862, the 1862 Abraham Lincoln is going to get panicky. Major threat in the Shenandoah Valley. My army out there has been routed. But Grant is more stoic than that. Grant actually had a multi-pronged plan for the Shenandoah Valley, not just Sigel coming north, but he had another wing under the command of General George Crook coming in south, down in the vicinity of Pulaski and Wytheville, Virginia. And they were supposed to take out vital Confederate logistical structures in that area. That's off map. That's 70 miles or so south of Roanoke along Interstate 81. And they would fail to get to the lead mines at Wytheville. Crook would win a battle at Cloyd's Mountain on May 9th. But however, he would get no word. They would destroy the railroad bridge over the New River where modern day Radford is at. But having received false information in the telegraph office down there that Grant had been defeated at the Battle of the Wilderness and was retreating back across the Rapidan River, he decided that he better fall back. So the plan was originally him and Sigel were going to meet at Stanton. So that's just like in 62 when Milroy falls back into the mountains of West Virginia, he will appear once again. Now, Grant is going to turn to another general to take his place, Major General David Hunter, a guy who has had a lot of negative PR about himself. Some of it deserved. But one of the things that's important to understand about General David Hunter is he owes his position to President Lincoln. He shared Lincoln's anti-slavery views. In fact, when Lincoln was elected president, they didn't have Secret Service and things like that. There was a group of Army officers who shared his political beliefs, and they actually escorted him to Washington, D.C. from Illinois. And Hunter was among them. And so Hunter was given rank and command of one of the divisions that would fight at the Battle of Bull Run. Unfortunately, he's going to be wounded at the outset of the battle over on Matthews Hill. And when he comes back in, he's pretty boisterous about wanting an important command. So he's going to be given a coastal command down off the coast of South Carolina. And Lincoln is constantly having to intervene with Hunter because Hunter's complaining that the neighboring commander was not lending him troops and they weren't cooperating. So finally, at one point, Lincoln writes him a letter and says, you need to act well your part. You are doing your best to ruin yourself right now. So he had to get things in. But Hunter ultimately would be relieved of command, but he's going to get a second chance here in 1864. Largely because during the siege of Chattanooga, Grant and Hunter had been down there and kind of an inspection tour. The two men had made a good bond and effective relationship in the brief time they were together. So he had been lobbying Grant for commands of a corps or something. And so Grant immediately, within 6 days of the defeat at Newmarket, he will replace Sigel with Hunter. And within 3 weeks later from the Battle of Newmarket, let me go back here, General David Hunter would win a massive victory in the Shenandoah Valley at the Battle of Piedmont. It's a forgotten battle. That's why the title of my book on this is called The Forgotten Fury, the Battle of Piedmont. But actually more men are going to be killed and wounded in this Battle of Piedmont on June 5th of 1864 than in any individual battle of Stonewall Jackson's 1862 campaign. So, when you have commanders, Hunter and Jones, and nobody really knows who they are, it tends to fade into oblivion. But Hunter would win this battle. He would inflict 1,500 casualties and move on and capture Stanton, as they were noticed by the local townsmen, the first Yankees ever there. They tore up the railroad and they were soon joined by about another 10,000 men, so that their entire force is about 17,000 strong. George Crook's men had come over the mountains from West Virginia and joined them at Stanton. Now I'm going to go back to that map again and talk about what was Grant's big picture here. And the thing, we're not mentioning Lincoln a lot, but that's the major change here. Grant is being allowed to conduct operations here in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. He's not being micromanaged because Lincoln has confidence in him and he trusts him that he's going to do the right thing. So Grant has a grand scheme developed in the early part of June of 1864. And he has cavalry under the command of Phil Sheridan. He's been operating around North Anna, Cold Harbor area. And he's going to move out. And their objective is going to be down in the lower right-hand corner there, Gordonsville. And that's where the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which comes down from Alexandria through Orange to Gordonsville, and joins the Virginia Central, which comes east out of the Shenandoah Valley through Charlottesville before going down towards Richmond. So he wants that railroad taken out. So he has Sheridan's cavalry moving up towards Gordonsville from the east, and orders for Hunter are to move through Waynesboro, across the Blue Ridge Mountains, and join forces with Sheridan at Gordonsville. After neutralizing the railroad, Grant envisions that they're going to move and attack Richmond from the northwest. Well, that's all well and good, but there's no telegraph line to reach Sheridan out there in the Virginia Piedmont. And Hunter quickly learns that the forces that he had defeated at Piedmont are going to be reinforced by the same force that Breckinridge that had at Newmarket. He had since gone to help Lee win the Battle of Cold Harbor. It gets set back, and they're blockading the gap just east of Waynesboro on the railroad. So Hunter decides that what he's going to do is he's going to go south to Lexington and then cut over the mountains at the Peaks of Otter and move on Lynchburg, Virginia, which was a vital Confederate logistics center. The Orange and Alexandria Railroad continued moving southwest from Gordonsville and Charlottesville down to Lynchburg. And there it joined the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad coming up carrying lead and other supplies from Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee. And those two railroads joined another line that ran east to a small town of some importance in '64 called Petersburg. So at the very moment that Grant's starting to move on Petersburg in June of 1864, David Hunter is threatening the vital supply depot to the west with his army. As they're getting closer, Hunter's chief of staff writes in his diary, he says, "Nothing less than a corps from the Army of Northern Virginia can stop us now. We have the vitals of the Confederacy in our grasp." Well, that's quite prophetic because that's exactly what General Robert E. Lee did. Robert E. Lee is going to detach 10,000 infantrymen around June 9th, 10th, which is 20% of his effective infantry strength to head out to save Lynchburg. Jubal Early will indeed do that and more. Now, Lee has further instructions for Jubal Early, and that is move north through the Shenandoah Valley, threaten Washington, D.C. The primary objective of that is to try and get some of the pressure off of Lee. Lee recognized and it's documented that he told Davis that if we get into a siege around Richmond and Petersburg, it's only going to be a matter of time, but we will lose. So he's trying to free up pressure, and he will very nearly succeed. Now, Jubal Early will proceed northward. By July 7th, he's going to be at Harper's Ferry. And it's there that the bungling Sigel, who has actually done a very good job of taking the few troops that he did have along the Potomac River and putting them up on Maryland Heights outside of Harper's Ferry. And he's going to hold Early up for a few days while he's maneuvering around Harper's Ferry before Early decides to bypass that and move east through Frederick, Maryland. And what will happen at that point is in that time frame that Sigel had gained, the troops under General Lew Wallace are going to move east from Baltimore. And Wallace never really gets the due. He never got orders. He's going to leave his command. His jurisdiction ended, and he went beyond his jurisdiction as a commander to move to the east side of Frederick and confront Early's advance. Fortunately for him, he will receive the first of the reinforcements that Grant will send north. So Grant sending Ricketts Division of the 6th Army Corps northward. They will fight a one-day delaying action that's going to buy time for additional reinforcements to reach Washington, D.C. Wallace will be defeated, but as Grant had noted, he accomplished more in defeat than other generals have done in victory in terms of the battle for time, the time that he gained there. Now, on July 11th, we have Jubal Early showing up at the gates of Washington, D.C. And this is going to be a time frame that for Abraham Lincoln, if he was tense during the 1862 Valley campaign, that really got ratcheted up. As things were moving along, they stopped getting updates because Early's cavalry had severed all of the telegraph wires. And so Hunter's army, in the meantime, had retreated from Lynchburg directly west, again, into the mountains of West Virginia, and he's basically going to be out of the active theater of war for a little less than a month. So the only troops that are there to defend Washington initially are some Ohio National Guard. They're pulling men out of the offices and giving them muskets. So you've got brigades of clerks moving to occupy the massive fortifications. There's a lot of militia types from the area, short-term troops. And then finally, there will be the vanguard from the Army of the Potomac, the 25th Cavalry from New York. They were dismounted, and Lincoln personally rides out to greet them and tells them and their commanding officer what a dire threat that the nation was under, and that he urging them to go forward and help say it. But he tells them, he warns them, if you're captured, don't tell them, just tell them you're the vanguard of the 6th Corps. And so that's what a dire situation it was. By July 11th, the 6th Corps has arrived. It is in the trenches, and there's some skirmishing going on. And that day, Lincoln is actually out in the vicinity of Fort Stevens and in the breastworks, watching a skirmish go on. There's a lot of stories about Lincoln's presence there. Horatio Wright, commander of the 6th Corps, urging him down. Another story has it that future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes yells, "Get down from there, you fool." We don't know for sure. There's another story that it was a lady who was an African-American cook with the 6th Corps who yelled for Lincoln to get down from there, Betty Thomas. But Lincoln is there, and he's out there. And it was said that Lincoln said that as he was the constitutional commander-in-chief, he should at least have the opportunity to be out there watching the men who served under his command while they were in action. Well, Jubal Early is going to realize, that the jig is up and that Washington is well defended. Early only had about 16,000 men total of all arms when he started this campaign. Probably loses about 1,000 or more of various causes after the Battle of Manassas. He's got cavalry ranging out between Washington and Baltimore. And so these 12,000 men from the 6th Corps are going to be more. Plus, Jubal Early, what do you do with Washington, D.C. once you capture it? Obviously, Grant just doesn't have the 6th Corps, but he's got another corps, the 19th Corps, with another 12,000 men on boats coming up from the Richmond and Petersburg area as well. So Early prudently pulls away and withdraws back into Virginia. He is going to be pursued by General Horatio Wright, and Wright will be very ginger in his approach, in his aggressiveness in following him up. Now, it's at the same time that Wright is pursuing westward out of Washington that General David Hunter's troops begin arriving in Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry, having used the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And they're starting to filter down, threatening Early's line of retreat. So there was some real opportunity for them to do something. However, as President Lincoln recognized in terms of Horatio Wright, who was the overall commander, it looked as just when he got where he might have accomplished something, it looked as if he might have actually been afraid of coming across some rebels and actually capturing them. So Wright comes under a lot of criticism for this. Wright's more interested in getting his army back to Washington and down to Petersburg. But Early is going to fight a delaying action on July 18th, fall back into the Shenandoah Valley. Wright, 2 days later, will declare that the object of the expedition has been successfully accomplished, and Early is in full retreat on Richmond, that they have that on good authority of sources that they have encountered in the Shenandoah Valley. So Wright returns to Washington. And it seems that once again, Lincoln and Washington, D.C. have dodged the bullet. Well, not so fast. Jubal Early gets back, and about 20 miles south of Winchester is Fisher's Hill. He's going to rest and regroup his army there. He gets word from General Lee on July 22nd that says, hey, you can bring your army back here and join me in the trenches at Petersburg against Grant, or you can undertake further offensive operations in the Shenandoah Valley. The goal is you got to keep all those troops that had joined Horatio Wright in Washington, D.C. up there with you and not let them come back here and overwhelm the Army of Northern Virginia on the Richmond-Petersburg front. That's exactly what General Early is going to do. And we're going to tip off, this is just going to be a continuation of a July of 1864 that in terms of Lincoln's political reelection efforts is just going to be devastating to his chances. On July 24th, Early will win the Battle of Kernstown, routing George Crook, who had about 10,000 men, the remnant of Hunter's army. And this is after Wright is well on his way to Washington, D.C. And Crook retreats back across the Potomac River, and he's guarding the passes in the Blue Ridge. His main goal is to prevent Early from turning east and attacking once again either Washington or Baltimore. But what he does is he lives, if you look out there to the north, is Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, just beyond the continuation up from Martinsburg there. You keep going up the road, you get to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And David Hunter had burned Virginia Military Institution in the homes of several prominent Virginians during his tenure in the Shenandoah Valley. So in retaliation for that, Early burns Chambersburg, Pennsylvania to the ground on July 30th of 1864. This is at a time when Lincoln is trying to win the war. The people of the North are supposed to be seeing progress. As Jubal Early had written, we got closer to the dome of the Union capital of Washington, D.C. than they have ever been to ours. And it's just disastrous at this point. About the same time, at the end of July, is to create the crater fiasco down at Petersburg. And Lincoln is just growing despondent over what's happening. But he's keeping his cool there. It's going to be in early August that Henry Halleck's going to step in. And he's going to tell Grant right out. He says, look, things are not going well. And he's pointing out all these disasters to him. And he says, it's time to rein in the sails and slow things down a bit. This was essentially like a decision. Let's wait and see what's going on with Sherman, and let's not take so many risks here in Virginia, be it in the Shenandoah Valley or in the Richmond-Petersburg front. And so that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, at this point, this is Henry Halleck here on that. Grant is going to appoint Phil Sheridan as commander. They're going to consolidate all of the forces that had been in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring and summer. The problem that they had was as Early moved through the Shenandoah Valley, he was technically in the Department of West Virginia, which was under Hunter's jurisdiction. Then there was a middle military department. Then there was the Department of the Susquehanna, which encompassed Chambersburg. And then there was the Department of Washington. And there was no single head of that until you got to Ulysses S. Grant, who obviously had his hands full with the sieges of Petersburg and Richmond at the time. They actually Grant had recognized that a reorganization needed to take place on the heels of the Early's raid to Washington. And on July 24th, the same day that Early is winning the victory at Kernstown, about the middle of the day, Grant basically sends a telegraph up to Washington, D.C. saying, hey, we need to get that reorg thing moving again here. But Grant initially wanted to appoint William B. Franklin to that command. And he was, because of his close associations with George McClellan, Lincoln and his administration, that was a no-go. A guy who really wanted it was George Meade. He was chafing under, the close, constant supervision that he was getting from Grant in the management of the Army of the Potomac. But ultimately, it went to Phil Sheridan. When Phil Sheridan met Abraham Lincoln, Sheridan was later described by the president as a brown, chunky little chap with short legs, not enough neck to hang him, and arms so long that he could scratch his ankles without having to bend over. Yeah. So he was not, an impressive figure, although it was said that when Sheridan was in a horse, that his diminutive stature was primarily the result of exceedingly short legs, but that he did strike somewhat of a commanding figure when he was mounted and sitting on a horse. There was nothing in his background to say that he was going to be the successful commander that he would ultimately turn out to be in the Shenandoah and during the Appomattox campaigns. He had successfully served as an infantry commander, with his peaks coming his efforts at Stones River, and then at the Battle of Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge, where he came under Grant's immediate observation. Grant saw that he was the only guy that pushed on and went for the jugular, even though he was unsuccessful. Grant liked that aggressiveness that he saw in him. And so that's really how he ends up with this command. Now, he gets out there, and the original orders that Hunter had, and Hunter recognizes that he is, the third wheel. And so he turns everything over to Sheridan. Sheridan starts operating in the Shenandoah Valley. About the middle of August, he gets word that there are massive reinforcements, about 5,000-6,000 men under Dick Anderson that have joined Early. And so Sheridan is going to pull back to the vicinity of Harper's Ferry. And it is there that he's going to stay there for the better part of from middle of August until the middle of September. And there's going to be a lot of questions. What's he doing there? Is he afraid of Early? And the Confederates are believing that this Early, there's actually quotes that say, he'll soon be taking the same road that Crooks, Bank, Milroy, Sigel, and the rest of them have taken, and we'll have him on the run out of the valley as well. But Grant and Halleck, in response to Halleck's urging, said, you know what we're going to do? You're not going to go on the offensive until we know that Early has returned those reinforcements to Richmond. Sheridan would find out on September 16th that infantry division is on its way back to Richmond, and Lincoln had started to grow antsy. And for one of the first times in 1864, we see a telegram from Lincoln to Grant say, hey, couldn't we scrounge up a regiment from here and there to the tune of about 10,000 extra men and give them to Sheridan and go on the offensive? Well, Grant senses that Lincoln is growing apprehensive. And so he takes a trip out to the Shenandoah Valley, and in Charlestown, what's now Charlestown, West Virginia, the two men meet in the Rutherford house, and Grant listens to Sheridan. Sheridan already has a plan in place since he knows that division is leaving. And Grant looks at the plan and said, I had my own plan in my pocket and I never took it out. It was the easiest orders that I ever gave. I simply told him to go in. And go in he would. Sheridan would launch a combined arms assault that would be after an all-day seesaw fight on September 19th on the northern and eastern outskirts of the Battle of Winchester, where the cavalry, infantry, and artillery would all ultimately take equal parts of the share of the glory in routing Jubal Early's army. Sent them whirling through Winchester. Now, let's go back just briefly and examine the history of Union troops, not just in the Shenandoah Valley, but in Virginia. You know, you'd had some successful defensive actions during the 7 days, Bristow Station, a defensive victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1862. But every time, like in the overland, in the wilderness, in Spotsylvania, it always seemed that just when the Union forces were about on the verge of victory, the Confederates would pull a rabbit out of the hat and pull out a victory, or at least carry the Union efforts at that point. But for the first time on September 19th of 1864, these Confederates, the old Second Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, are going to be routed in confusion. On the heels of that victory, Lincoln wrote to Sheridan and said, "Just heard of your victory. Strongly inclined to come up and see you. God bless you all, officers and men." Now imagine the security problems Lincoln would have had going through Mosby's country to get out there. Sheridan would follow that up with 3 more victories at Fisher's Hill on September 22nd, and the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19th, where Early counterattacked, and Sheridan's army was routed, and Sheridan had just returned from Washington and rallies his men and launches a counterattack in the afternoon that wins the day. Lincoln wrote to him the next day, October 20th of 1864, "With great pleasure, I tender you and your brave army the thanks of the nation and my own personal admiration and gratitude for the month's operations in the Shenandoah, and especially for the splendid work of October 19th of 1864. The 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign under Sheridan would seal Lincoln's reelection efforts. It's important to remember that while Atlanta falls on September 1st, that Virginia, in that massive conflict between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, was always going to be the decisive theater of war. And if the Union could not succeed in Virginia, the Northern electorate would have its doubts. This was the beginning of the end. This was the first chunk taken out of the foundation of the Army of Northern Virginia that would ultimately lead to Union success on April 9th with the surrender at Appomattox. More importantly, it will contribute significantly to Lincoln's reelection effort. In fact, the New York Times, the Philadelphia newspaper wrote of these victories in the Valley. It says, "When Sheridan advances, McClellan goes backwards." George McClellan was the Democratic candidate challenging Lincoln. So the New York Times wrote that the whole city is alive with rejoicing over Sheridan's victory, and we only await similar news from Grant, with all 4 letters of Grant capitalized. So thank you all, and appreciate it.
I seem to remember early on that Sheridan formed a cavalry, a very large cavalry in the Shenandoah, and I've seen numbers as large as 75,000 men on horses. Did that happen?
No. The 10,000 number is exaggerated. He had a cavalry corps that at its largest in 1864 was 7,500 men. And the Confederates had responded in kind. Initially, they sent out Fitz Lee and Hampton's division, but then some movements that Grant had made around Richmond called the recall of Hampton's division. So they only got up to about 5,000 men strong there. But they ended up playing a very decisive role in that campaign. And one of the things is going to be Sheridan's usage of cavalry, again, in combined arms with the infantry and artillery, as a main chess piece on the field of battle out there. And he would continue that, not just in the Valley, but in the 1865 Appomattox campaign as well.
Okay, we have a Zoom question for you.
Why did David Hunter retreat into West Virginia after his defeat at Lynchburg in June 1864, rather than retreat down the valley and toward federal supply lines?
Yes, David Hunter, largely on the advice of Major General George Crook, one of his infantry division commanders who had spent a lot of time in West Virginia, the thought was that they would retreat through the mountains, and when they got to Charleston, they would put the troops on river boats and then go up to the Ohio River and then hook up with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and everything would be fine. Well, two things they didn't count on. First, Mother Nature. There hadn't been a lot of rain, and a lot of the rivers were low, and the troop carriers were bottoming out, and they had to march around that. And also, as Jubal Early had gone forward, he had torn up significant chunks of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the northern stretches of the Shenandoah Valley. So the move backfired.
The first slide you had there about this back and forth, this decision making. When McDowell was sent west instead of south, obviously he was discombobulated, as was everybody. And McClellan complained about it. Of course, Lincoln, as usual, disregarded. But when McDowell complained and said exactly the same thing that McClellan did, that this was ridiculous. He says, we will do nothing. Let Jackson wander around. It makes no difference. The key is to go to. Why did Lincoln ignore McDowell, whom he trusted? And so what was the decision making back in what was it Halleck or Stanton for whispering in Lincoln's ear, we have to stop Jackson above all?
Well, Halleck's not there in the spring of '62. So, it's Lincoln. Trying to think, is Stanton there yet? I don't think Stanton. But anyway, it's Lincoln's decisions, and I couldn't fathom why he didn't listen to McDowell. At that point, Lincoln's fixated on the Shenandoah Valley and the situation. I don't think it had anything to do with the personalities there, although McClellan certainly did. He was more concerned that he had a disaster brewing in the Shenandoah Valley. And that was, the proximity of that to Washington, and again, just, war president, it's only still in the first year of the war. It started in July of '61 and full run, and, we're still there. And
Okay, we'll have one last question here.
That map is very historic. Hillsborough was the route that General Burgoyne took George Washington when they fought at Pittsburgh. And Hillsborough is also the mother of the Wright brothers, the birthplace.
oh, you mean Braddock, General Braddock?
What?
Braddock,
Right.
General Braddock.
Yeah, it was very well known. We lived out there.
Yeah. Yep. Following that through.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We appreciate your talk here.